January. Green River Valley, Wyoming. 1832. A man named Warren Ferris stands outside a log cabin and watches the thermometer. It hasn't moved above 0 in 11 days. The fire inside has burned through what amounts to a small forest. The cabin walls are chinked with mud. The mud cracked in October. Cold air pours through the gaps like water through a broken hull. Every morning, the men inside wake to frost on their blankets. 80 yards away, across a frozen clearing, 8 buffalo skin lodges stand in a cluster. No smoke coming from most of them, just a thin thread from 1 or 2, barely visible in the gray morning. The men inside those lodges are not burning through a forest. Some haven't fed their fires since yesterday evening. Ferris will later write down what he observes. He will move from the cabin into one of those lodges, and when someone asks him why, his answer is 6 words that should have changed how every person who followed him into these mountains thought about cold. He said the lodge was much more pleasant than the other. That's it. No dramatic explanation. No engineering lecture. A quiet preference stated plainly. The way you'd prefer one chair over another. Here's the question nobody asks. How does a cone of stitched animal hides, open to the air at the top, heated by a fire any child could blow out, how does that outperform a sealed log structure burning twice the fuel? The answer is not what you think. And it was not invented by the mountain men. They borrowed it. Imperfectly at first, then correctly, and the ones who learned it correctly tended to come home. The ones who didn't are mostly names on a list somewhere, with a date and the word winter written next to them. Before we get into what Ferris found inside that lodge, you need to understand what everyone at the time believed about staying warm in the Rocky Mountain winter, because the belief was coherent, it made sense, and it was wrong. The year is 1832. Benjamin Bonneville, captain in the U.S. Army, experienced officer, not a fool, arrives at the Green River near what is now Daniel, Wyoming. He has 110 men. He has 20 wagons. He has a plan. He orders construction of a log fort, 100 feet square, 15-foot walls of 12-inch cottonwood logs, blockhouses on opposite corners. Bonneville builds what he knows, what men from the eastern states know, what civilization looks like when it needs to defend itself against winter. Joseph Walker, his own chief lieutenant, tells him this is wrong. The free trappers he consults confirm it. The Green River Valley at elevation, exposed to wind from multiple directions, hits temperatures so low that the National Weather Service still occasionally records some of the nation's coldest readings in the communities near there. The first heavy snowfall comes and proves Walker right. The fort is abandoned within weeks. The trappers who spent days building it call it Fort Nonsense. Some call it Bonneville's Folly. Both names stick. Bonneville himself retreats to the Salmon River in Idaho, where he builds again, log cabins again, which Warren Ferris, who was there, describes as miserable establishments, low, badly constructed. The men scatter to Nez Perce and Flathead winter camps. And then Bonneville does something that saves his expedition. He buys lodges from the Shoshone. He arranges to camp through the winter alongside people who know what winter here actually is. Washington Irving records this. The military officer has learned what every seasoned trapper already knows, and the lesson cost him an entire construction project and 2 months of suffering to understand. Here is the first question this creates. If the log cabin was so wrong, what was the skin lodge doing that was so different? The answer begins with a physical fact, so counterintuitive that most people reject it the first time they hear it. Cold doesn't flow into warm spaces, heat flows out of them. That distinction sounds academic until you realize it changes everything about how you build a shelter. The log cabin that Bonneville built and Ferris endured was a machine for losing heat. The skin lodge was a machine for holding it. A 6-inch softwood log wall delivers roughly R8 insulation. For context, and this is where the comparison starts to sting, modern building codes for cold climate exterior walls require R13 to R19 minimum. The men building log forts in the 1830s were constructing shelters that would fail current building code for a house in Minnesota, and the problem gets worse. Green logs shrink as they dry. Every fur trade fort in the Rockies was built from trees cut within days of construction. As the wood dried over that first winter, the logs pulled apart. Gaps opened between courses, gaps that admitted wind, moisture, and cold air at a rate that no amount of mud chinking could permanently stop. Freeze-thaw cycles cracked the chinking. Every morning brought new gaps. Filling them was a losing race. Air infiltration in a badly chinked log cabin at -20 degrees Fahrenheit accounts for somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 BTUs per hour of heat loss in a 12 by 12 foot structure. To replace that heat with fire, you burn roughly 1 to 2 cords of wood per week, a stack of firewood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 16 feet long, burned through in 7 days, in a winter that lasts 5 months. The outer cover of a skin lodge is dressed buffalo hide, which in winter condition runs somewhere between R4 and R7 insulation on its own. But the outer cover is not doing the main insulation work. The main work is done by something most people looking at a teepee from the outside never think about, which is the liner. Inside the lodge, hanging from a rope strung pole to pole around the interior perimeter, is an inner curtain of hide or cloth. It runs about 6 feet high. There is a gap of 4 to 6 inches between the outer cover and this inner liner. That gap traps still air. Still air barely conducts heat at all. It's one of the best insulating substances that exists. The liner creates a dead air space that functions almost identically to modern double-wall construction, and it does something else as well. Cold outside air enters under the outer cover at ground level, flows upward through that gap between cover and liner, warms as it rises past the fire zone, and exits through the smoke hole at the top. This convection current draws smoke out efficiently and continuously refreshes interior air without letting raw outside cold directly into the living space. The liner also catches condensation. Moisture runs down the outer side of the liner and diverts to the ground outside the sleeping area, not onto the people inside. Reginald and Gladys Laban, who spent decades studying teepee construction among Plains tribes, described the result plainly. The teepee, they wrote, becomes warm and snug in the severest winter weather through this convection and insulation system. It works in summer too. Reverse the air direction slightly, open the cover flaps, and the structure cools itself. The men trading in the Rockies from 1810 onward were living inside one of the most thermally efficient portable shelters ever designed. And most of them understood this only in the way you understand a chair is comfortable by sitting in it, not by measuring the airflow. Here is what the physics actually show when you put both shelters side by side at -20 degrees Fahrenheit outside, 65 degrees Fahrenheit inside. The log cabin at those conditions, roughly 100 square feet, poorly chinked, loses heat at a rate somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 BTUs per hour. The skin lodge of comparable size, with liner, loses roughly 8,000 BTUs per hour. That's a gap of 2 to 4,000 BTUs. The fire required to close that gap, over a 5-month winter, represents weeks of additional firewood, and the gap in air leakage is even wider than the insulation numbers suggest, because the lodge, when properly staked and weighted at the ground edge, had almost no air infiltration at floor level. The cabin had cracks everywhere. This is why Ferris moved. He was not being romantic. He was cold, and then he was less cold, and he wrote about it. There's a layer beneath the liner that almost no account mentions, and it's the part that allowed men in well-made lodges to let their fires die at night and wake up still warm. Rufus Sage, writing around 1842, described the standard mountain man winter shelter. He described sleeping on a buffalo robe, spread on the ground, wrapped in another robe. That's the surface picture. What Ferris described in detail was the full floor system, and it tells a different story. Inside the lodges he inhabited, he wrote, "The bottoms were covered with reeds, upon which our blankets and robes were spread. Reeds first, then robes. 6 to 8 inches of packed reeds or dried grass delivers roughly R6 to R9 of insulation. In colder camps, pine boughs could push that toward R12. Beneath that insulation layer, the earth itself became a thermal asset. Soil temperature at 3 to 5 feet below the surface throughout the Rocky Mountain region holds at approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The frost line in Wyoming reaches 56 inches before the ground freezes solid, which means the earth below that depth is a constant, moderate heat source relative to the air above it. A man sleeping on 6 inches of dry grass insulation over that earth is not sleeping on cold ground. He's sleeping on a surface that is slowly, steadily releasing warmth from 3 feet below him, warmth that the insulation layer holds in the sleeping space, rather than letting it disperse upward. Add a buffalo robe beneath him, another above him, and a dog across his legs, as Rudolf Kurtz documented was common practice. We called to our dogs to lie on top of us for the purposes of keeping guard and also of imparting warmth and the metabolic heat of 3 people and 2 dogs in a sealed sleeping space can maintain survivable temperatures through an overnight fire going cold. 2 adults at rest produce approximately 600 to 700 BTUs per hour of body heat. In a well-insulated lodge with no fire, the total heat loss might drop to somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 BTUs per hour overnight. The gap between body heat and heat loss, roughly 2,500 BTUs per hour, determines how long you stay warm. That gap, bridged by the insulation underfoot and the dead airliner above, was the difference between a fire that maintained comfort and a fire that was the only thing standing between a man and death. The men who knew this let their fires run small in the evening, built them up briefly at dawn for cooking, and otherwise relied on a thermal system, not a fuel system, to stay alive. That system did not come from Europe. It did not come from the eastern states. And the men who learned it correctly learned it from one place. 3 weeks before Warren Ferris made his note about the lodge, George Catlin sat inside a Mandan earth lodge on the upper Missouri River and wrote the most precise thermal observation anyone would record about indigenous shelter in that century. He wrote that these lodges were perfectly warm, even when the thermometer stood at 40 degrees below zero. He was not exaggerating. He was an artist who had been trained to observe precisely. And what he observed was the endpoint of a construction technology that had been refined over generations on the northern plains, a technology that solved the same problem the mountain men were solving, but solved it more completely. The Mandan Earth Lodge began with excavation, a circular pit, 12 to 24 inches deep in basic construction. Some variants went deeper, ranging from 25 to 60 feet in diameter. An inner ring of tall cottonwood columns and an outer ring of shorter posts supported a dome of radial poles. Over that framework came a layer of thatch, willows, grass, reeds, then clay packed against the sapling mat, then sections of living sod. The final earth covering ran 2 to 3 feet thick. Then the entrance tunnel, 6 to 15 feet long, typically facing south or east. That tunnel was an airlock. Outside air hit the tunnel entrance, slowed, lost momentum, partially warmed by contact with the earth walls of the passage before it ever entered the main lodge. Wind that could drive a man to his knees 50 feet away was a mild draft by the time it entered the living space. The thermal mathematics here are not subtle. An above-ground shelter at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside and 65 degrees Fahrenheit inside faces a temperature differential of 85 degrees Fahrenheit, driving heat outward through every surface. An earth-sheltered structure, where the soil at contact depth holds at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, faces a differential of only 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The driving force for heat loss drops by 82%, not through better insulation values, but through contact with a medium that is simply much warmer than the air above it. Catlin's observation was thermodynamically correct. 40 below zero outside, comfortable inside. Because the lodge wasn't fighting minus 40-degree air through its walls. It was sitting against 50-degree earth. Prince Maximilian of Wyde and artist Karl Bodmer spent the winter of 1833-34 actually living among the Mandan, not just visiting in summer the way Catlin had. Bodmer's paintings from that winter show people going about daily life inside these structures with the kind of comfort that requires no fire for primary heat. A central hearth existed for cooking, for light, for ceremony, not for survival. The mountain men who wintered with the Mandan, with the Hidatsa, with the Arikara, with the Pawnee, who married into these communities and lived inside these lodges through full winters, brought pieces of that knowledge westward, not always fully, not always correctly, but the influence shows up in how the best adapted trappers built their winter camps. Sheltered valleys chosen for ground warmth as much as wind protection, lodges positioned to draw geothermal benefit, floors insulated against a cold that wasn't really coming from below. The men who didn't learn this built log forts. The men who learned it bought lodges from the Shoshone and went through the winter warm. Go back to that Green River Valley in December 1832, not to Bonneville's fort, which is already abandoned, but to the Shoshone camp where Bonneville's men are now wintering. The temperature drops to -35. Wind comes down from the Wind River Range in gusts that knock untethered equipment over. Inside the skin lodges, the fires burn small. The liner system does its work. The floor insulation does its work. The men play cards. They sleep. They argue. They read Osborne Russell, who would winter in similar lodges for years. Describes what he called the Rocky Mountain College. Long evenings of men debating philosophy and reading Shakespeare aloud by firelight, from small fires in lodges where fire was a luxury, not a lifeline. Outside, if you approached the camp from downwind, you'd see almost nothing to indicate human habitation. A cluster of conical shapes, a few thin wisps of smoke, nothing like the column of smoke pouring from a chinked log cabin burning through its second cord of the week. The horses were another problem entirely. And this is where the knowledge transfer gets more complicated. Keeping horses through a Rocky Mountain winter required knowing one thing, that no European settler brought with them, and that the animal itself couldn't communicate. The difference between sweet cottonwood and bitter cottonwood. The inner bark of sweet cottonwood populous deltoids was horse feed. William Henry Ashley, who founded the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, called it almost as nutritious as Timothy Hay. Osborne Russell, wintering with Jim Bridger's brigade in 1836–37, wrote that the bottoms along these rivers are heavily timbered with sweet cottonwood, and our horses and mules are very fond of the bark which we strip from the limbs and give them every night. The Pawnee had a specific word for this practice, for the tree itself as horse fodder. Zenas Leonard's party learned the distinction, the catastrophic way in the winter of 1831–32 on the Laramie Plains. They established camp on November 4 along the Laramie River. They collected what they thought was cottonwood bark. Leonard writes, "To our utter surprise and discomfiture, on presenting it to them they would not eat it, and upon examining it by tasting, we found it to be the bitter, instead of the sweet cottonwood." By the end of December, most of their horses were dead. The men survived on foot for 5 months and walked out April 20 through deep snow. When they reached the plains again, Leonard records, they stopped at the first sweet cottonwoods they found and let the surviving mules feast on the inner bark for days. The mules knew what the men hadn't. The knowledge that saved Leonard's horses in spring was the knowledge that killed his horses in winter. The bark that meant the difference between a working pack animal and dead weight in a snowdrift was indistinguishable by appearance from the bark that was useless. You had to know. And the knowing came from the people who'd been watching these animals eat these trees for generations. Here is what the lodge system looked like at full deployment, what the best adapted mountain men were actually running as a winter survival architecture, not as romanticized campfire mythology. They chose the site first. A valley with a southern exposure where possible, protected from prevailing wind by terrain, sweet cottonwood in the bottoms for the horses, a spring or running water that wouldn't freeze solid. Warren Ferris described his brigade's winter camp of 1,834–35, 8 leathern lodges, and 2 constructed of poles covered with cane grass, pitched in a grove of aspens at the brink of an excellent spring. The spring meant liquid water in January. The aspens meant windbreak. The south-facing valley meant slightly more solar gain on short winter days. Then came the lodge construction. A skin lodge with liner, floor reeds spread 6 to 8 inches deep, baggage stacked around the interior perimeter at ground level to seal the base against drafts. Ferris noted this explicitly. Our baggage was placed around at the bottom of the lodge on the inside to exclude the cold from beneath it. The baggage was not stored there for convenience. It was insulation. Everything had a thermal purpose. The fire in the center burned dry aspen when available. Ferris specifically praised dry aspen for burning clear without smoke, affording a brilliant light. The lodge in his account had natural light through the partially transparent hide during the day, firelight at night, and housed 7 or 8 men in a circular room roughly 10 feet in diameter. Advanced winter techniques passed from tribe to tribe across the plains, and eventually to the trappers who paid attention pushed the system further. A second liner layer, stuffed with hay between the 2 skins, created something close to a primitive fiberglass bat. A windbreak of brush or logs built around the exterior, 12 feet high, reduced the wind chill effect on the outer cover. Stones and heavy wood stacked on the cover's lower edge sealed the ground junction completely. The combined thermal performance of this system, outer cover, dead air space, liner, floor insulation, ground contact, created a shelter where a moderate fire maintained genuine comfort at temperatures that were killing horses 300 yards away in the open. And then there was the robe itself, the technology of last resort. If everything else failed, if a blizzard caught a man in the open, if the fire went out, if the lodge was lost, one object could still keep him alive. A winter buffalo robe harvested between November and February, when the fur reached maximum density, weighed between 15 and 24 pounds. The underfur measured 17 to 22 microns in diameter, comparable to cashmere. Thousands of still air pockets per square inch. The guard hairs, 3 to 5 inches long and hollow, provided wind resistance and a second layer of dead air. James Kleiman and William Sublette were caught on open prairie by a blizzard during a hunting trip with Crow Indians. No shelter. No fire possible. Kleiman records that when they tried to strike flint and steel, their hands went numb before they could get a spark. He writes of the cold, hard, frozen earth beneath them, of sleep being impossible, of desperation by morning. What kept them alive was the robes, not the fire they couldn't start. The system of trapped air between 2 men wrapped in bison fur on frozen ground. During the Lewis and Clark expedition, a 13-year-old boy survived an unprotected night at -40 degrees, covered only by a buffalo robe. He walked away with frostbitten feet. A robe and a body, and the physics of trapped air. The men who came back from the Rockies did so because they understood, in some operational sense, what the physics tell us explicitly. The goal is to reduce the temperature differential across your shelter walls, not to maximize heat generation. If the temperature outside is -20 and the temperature touching your outer wall is 40 because it's in contact with Earth, the fight you're in is entirely different from the fight with -20, touching log walls directly. Here's what is genuinely strange about all of this. The knowledge worked. It was documented. The men who used it said, plainly, that it worked. Ferris put it on paper. Russell put it on paper. Leonard put it on paper after losing his horses to the failure to use it correctly. And then, with the end of the fur trade in the late 1830s and early 1840s, the population of men who had lived inside this knowledge dispersed. Some became guides, some went home, some died. The lodges rotted, or were folded and put away by the people who had always owned the technology. What replaced the mountain man was the settler, and the settler built log cabins. Not because log cabins were better, because log cabins looked like what a civilized man was supposed to build. The 1840 presidential campaign of William Henry Harrison, Tippecanoe, and Tyler II built an entire political mythology around the log cabin as the symbol of honest American frontier virtue. The image of the log cabin was already more powerful than its thermal performance. Settlers moved west and built what the image demanded. The Mandan lodges that Catlin had called perfectly warm at -40, the ones that had kept people comfortable on the northern plains for generations before any European arrived, were described in popular accounts as primitive, as temporary, as the dwellings of people who hadn't yet learned to build properly. The settlers built log cabins, burned through their firewood, and suffered winters that the people they displaced had been managing comfortably for centuries. Daniel T. Potts, who spent the winter of 1828 to 29 trapped in Cache Valley, wrote home describing catastrophic losses. Horses gone to Blackfeet raiding, men lost to cold. He left the mountains and never came back. His letters survive. They read like a man who spent a winter fighting cold with fire alone. Joe Meek, who came through that same era, recalled waking in his lodge during the severe winter of 1832–33 with ice hanging from the roof poles. Inside the lodge, cold enough that even within the system, the limits showed. But Meek came back. Potts didn't. The difference between them is not courage. It is not even equipment in the simple sense. It is an understanding of where warmth actually comes from, not from the fire, but from the system that holds the fire's warmth in and keeps the cold's driving force low. Warren Ferris left the mountains in 1837. He became a surveyor in Texas. He wrote a book, Life in the Rocky Mountains, published posthumously. It contains, among other things, that 6-word sentence about the lodge being more pleasant than the cabin. Nobody read it as a thermal engineering insight. They read it as the preference of a man who had gone native, who'd spent too long in the field, who didn't know what a proper building was supposed to look like. The log cabin was the myth. The skin lodge was the mechanism. And the mechanism, once the people who carried it were gone or ignored, stopped being passed on. Go back to the Green River Valley one last time. January 1832. The log fort abandoned in snow. 80 yards away, the lodges still standing. A few thin wisps of smoke. Men inside who haven't fed their fires since last night. They're warm, not because fire is burning in every lodge, because earth below them holds at 40-something degrees, and a dead air space between 2 layers of buffalo hide holds the warmth in, and dry reeds beneath them block the cold that isn't even really coming from below, and because 2 or 3 dogs lay across their legs all night, and because the men who built these lodges understood, without any of the equations we use to describe it now, exactly what the equations show: reduce the differential. Not by generating more heat, by narrowing the gap between outside and inside. That's the method. That's what was forgotten. A complete understanding of how cold actually works, and a shelter system built around it that was refined over centuries, borrowed by a few hundred men who lived in the mountains, written down in the journals of those men, and then left on the shelf while everyone else built log cabins and complained about the cold. The lodges are gone. The men are gone. The dogs are long gone. But the earth under Wyoming still holds at 40 degrees in January. And that, it turns out, was always the point. Share project contentment Montaigne created by How Mountain Men. Avoid these styles were used. TXT 188 line STCT.